Nicole Burrowes, Morgan Cousins, Paula X, Rojas, and LJ on our own terms 10 years of radical community building with Sista to Sista. 10 years ago, a group of sisters at a local gathering gave birth to an idea that would become Sista to Sista. Inspired by a conversation about what they felt was missing from the workshops and panels presented, this group of young women in their 20s committed to addressing these and other silences. They envisioned a space for younger women of color that would speak to their complex identities, nourish their holistic development, and be responsive to their needs. Ultimately, this space would support sisters in their efforts to challenge the larger societal structures imposing on their daily lives. This essay is a reflection both of our current vision and some of what we've come to learn along the way about building collective power and justice for our sisters. Vision based in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn, New York, SIS supports young women to develop their personal and collective power. We began as a grassroots, all-volunteer organization in 1996 and remained so until 1999, when we formally incorporated as a nonprofit and received our first foundation grant. In our first few years, SIS's primary program was our Freedom Schools for young women of color. This comprehensive series of workshops and classes reflected our commitment to the holistic development of young women and included popular education workshops on oppression and B-girl dancing. With our first foundation grant, SIS rented our own space and hired part-time staff to coordinate our programs and collective tasks. Our work with young women of color is rooted in the principle of self-determination, the idea that all groups are able to identify and work toward solving their own problems. With this liberatory principle as our starting point, SIS has created an organization in which young women of color take leadership in transforming themselves and their communities. In line with our commitment 228, the revolution will not be funded to modeling our vision for the world we are fighting for. We have a flat, non-hierarchical collective structure that recognizes the value each individual brings to the organization. Another principle that guides our work is the intersectionality of oppression that young and adult women of color confront. Poor and working-class young women of color face a braid of oppression composed of various strands: racism, sexism, capitalism, ageism, and more, which presents them with multiple and unique challenges. While we have learned from Marxist critiques of capitalism, we don't see class as the only form of oppression or location from where to resist. We choose to work from the braid of oppression because it makes our analyses and strategies stronger. After all, a braid is harder to cut than its individual strands. When we are able to hold the complexities of our identities and work to create justice, we ask ourselves harder questions and are forced to be more creative in our approaches toward the challenges we are facing. Another aspect of our work that we stress is the personal as political, specifically the relationship between individual healing and larger community empowerment. Personal healing in isolation from a larger community cannot transform the world. Neither can social action without personal and emotional development. We view internal transformation as being interconnected with social transformation. Thus, creating spaces for emotional support should be viewed as political work. At SIS, our work goes beyond political education workshops and attending marches. We often use street theater, block parties, videos, dance contests, and hip-hop culture methods that help us to engage the community in deeper ways than traditional political work allows. Because many of our members are immigrants or children of immigrants, we feel connected to current revolutionary struggles in Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. Living in the belly of the beast, we recognize that our role is to learn from and support the leadership of women struggling in the global South, women who are directly confronting the intersection of sexism and racism under capitalist imperialism. Through these liberation struggles, we are reminded that power does not reside only in state institutions. It also resides in communities. Our struggles must go beyond merely seeking to hold those institutions accountable and instead seek to create alternatives and put into practice how we think our communities should address violence, childcare, healthcare, education, and other pressing social issues. These are the realizations that led us to develop SIS's Liberated Ground, which we will discuss in greater detail later. Foundations. Over the past few years, we have made some tough decisions at Sista to Sista. One of our major decisions was to stop pursuing foundation grants. After 9/11, foundations rapidly started moving in more conservative directions, reflecting the larger national climate. We were doing anti-war and anti-police brutality work, and some foundations found that distasteful in this new political climate. SIS had been the flavor of the month among the foundations, and that time was coming to an end. In the beginning, we were the new kids on the block with ideas and approaches that very few other organizations were using. Some foundations even pursued us and strongly encouraged us to apply for monies. As the political climate grew more overtly oppressive, our new and innovative ideas came to be seen as threatening and unfundable. It was around this time that we started working on Sista's Liberated Ground, a project aimed at creating violence-free zones for women in our community. We wanted the community to stand up against violence as a long-term solution because our dependence on a police system that was inherently sexist, homophobic, racist, and classist did not decrease the ongoing violence against women we were seeing in our neighborhoods. In fact, at times the police themselves were its main perpetrators. While some foundations continued to support us and saw our work as groundbreaking, many did not perceive our work as organizing because we weren't targeting an institution. Other foundations that funded our Freedom School program found out about the organizing work and would accuse us of brainwashing little girls. It was one thing for them to support the holistic development and empowerment of young women, and quite another when they realized these young women were collectively taking action to challenge the police and other oppressive figures in their lives and community. Simultaneously, we started feeling ever more constrained by the amount of grant writing, administration, site visits, and reports required by our dependence on foundation funding. We were drained by the rejections, the waiting, and the constant explanations of our work to people who just didn't get it, yet greatly influenced its direction. Our efforts to fit CISA's work into quantitative outcomes began to drain our energy and morale, and before long, SIS was transformed from a labor of love to a job. An impasse was coming. To determine our next steps, we organized 2 caucuses, one with young women and one with adult women. When the 2 groups reunited to share their findings, the adult women returned with heavy hearts and tired minds. They had not been able to come to a decision. More, several women had said that although they thought SIS needed to exist, they couldn't devote much time to it. Even though we were just shy of our 10th birthday, closing was 230. The revolution will not be funded, a very real possibility for us. Luckily, the young women presented the results of their discussion first. In their session, there had been no talk of closing SIS. They talked about what they wanted to see. They wanted more members, a new building, more dancing, a video project, and more organizing campaigns. They wanted Sista to Sista products that we would make and sell to raise money. As for foundations, who was thinking about them? New directions after several meetings with SIS membership, board members, the collective, and staff, we decided to take a leap of faith. We began asking ourselves some hard questions that stirred our minds and our spirits. What if we no longer had to raise $300,000 every year? What if our unrealistic timelines weren't based on promises made to foundations? What if SIS was not a job, but a passion? How can we ask people who are struggling to survive to join this project in their very little free time, yet think we should get paid to do the work? Why are we building our memberships within structures based on the corporate nonprofit model? What if we operated more like grassroots organizations in other countries? Hadn't the movement in the States been stifled by this 501 structure? What percentage of our time was spent raising money and writing reports versus doing the work? What happened to our commitment to self-determination? We felt blessed for several years to be able to receive money from foundations and feel somewhat autonomous. But we realized the revolution would not be funded. So we decided to take a risk and return to our roots, no more massive amounts of time doing foundation fundraising and no more full-time staff. We would return to being a volunteer collective and operate mainly through grassroots fundraising and the support of those who believed in our mission and work. At SIS, we always ask ourselves, where are we as a people's social justice movement in the U.S. today? Somehow many of us got sucked in by the notion that the most effective way to build a base for political education and community organizing is by creating nonprofit organizations. Part of the problem with this is that it wasn't necessarily a strategic decision, but more just the way that most people do it. For us at SIS, finally questioning these ideas came in part through our holistic approach, the cultural work we do, and our connections as immigrants to our extended families and communities, where no one has ever been paid to care for each other and create justice in our world. A global perspective in recent decades, the concept of social justice organizing has undergone tremendous change. Today, foundations and non-governmental organizations are taking over movements in many third-world countries, just as they did in the U.S. in the 1960s. In both cases, increased state and foundation involvement and control has actually weakened revolutionary social movements. For example, in the late 1960s and early 70s, thousands of poor Chileans engaged in organized takeovers of rural and suburban land and factories. Today, there are NGOs in those same communities working toward more reformist policies, urging the community to adopt less militant tactics. At one point, it was not uncommon for community leaders with little or no formal education to coordinate huge popular demonstrations. Today, leadership is often restricted to paid professional sociologists running NGO-driven projects in service of a community to which they often have little or no relationship. This important critique notwithstanding, SIS does not intend to oversimplify this often complicated dynamic. Truth be told, the relationships between NGOs and the communities in which they work are not always negative, nor do they all work in the same way. Some are strategically linked, and even directed by the revolutionary movements themselves. Others serve as a mechanism through which resources may be funneled to autonomous organizations of tens of thousands. For example, the Landless Peoples Movement in South Africa has strategically partnered with NGOs working on labor, tenant, and land rights both locally as well as internationally. Both the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, and the MST in Brazil have relationships with NGOs. And while many of these NGOs were started at the request of the movements, usually to provide specific skills or resources, ultimately they are not essential. If those NGOs collapse tomorrow, the movements would remain intact. Their members are connected to each other through participation in the movement, not through NGO trainings. This is in stark contrast to movements in the U.S., where many initiatives that came out of past revolutionary movements are now nonprofits of various sizes. Many of these organizations are creative and beautiful, but bear the mark of both the state and outside funders. That is, they are still clearly nonprofits. Professionalized and run with a corporate top-down structure, they spend much of their time chasing after foundation money instead of truly creating spaces for organic community participation and collective power. But if self-determination is key, then we need to approach collective organizing in ways that build collective power that is truly autonomous from the state. For SIS, this has meant returning to our origins as an all-volunteer grassroots organization. We aren't sure if it will work or if SIS will be around in 5 years. But we do know that had we continued along the path we've been traveling, we probably wouldn't have survived. In the end, we think the risk is worth trying to find what does actually work, especially if it might help other activists think differently. 232 The revolution will not be funded about what kind of movement building is and is not possible within the nonprofit system. Reality check recently, a survey of 20 youth organizing groups from around the country indicated that 71% of folks felt somewhat secure with their funding base. This comes as a bit of a surprise, considering that 92% of folks named foundations as their number one source of income. This translates into a huge problem for the movement. Ultimately, the foundation world will never offer longevity or financial stability to social justice movements or organizations. A recent report by the Greenlining Institute indicates that only 4% of grants from independent foundations and 3% of grants from community foundations are given to minority-led organizations. Point 1 Nevertheless, we're caught in the funding chase, endlessly running around, trying to connect with fellow activists and organizers who haven't had the time or space to reflect or build politically with others in their community while we are worried about completing 5 interim reports that are due the following day. There is another important piece to the sustainability puzzle. Philanthropy was not created to sustain any organization, movement, or idea that would undermine the goals of that small percentage of the population that controls most of society's wealth in the first place. Most foundations are endowed by the profits made from exploiting people of color through capitalism, and anything that threatens the interests of capitalism or the current social order is ultimately targeted by the foundation industry for obliteration. Foundations, overall, exert far too much control over organizations and, ultimately, over our movements for social change. Luring social justice activists with the promise of financial support, they also determine the rules of engagement. Meanwhile, we become trapped in the cycle of apply, threatened with proposal rejections, or even promised money being pulled if folks do not understand or agree with our vision. This is not to say that foundations cannot be a part of our strategy in raising money for social justice in this country. But for many activists, it seems like it is the main one, and for some, the only one. So what are some concrete ways that the youth movement could become self-sustaining? Most crucially, we must help each other diversify funding. There is a clear need for support in building solid personal donor bases, throwing benefit parties for organizations, and offering one-on-one technical assistance with whatever area of focus folks identify as their priority. When organizations do go a different route, supporting their various grassroots fundraising initiatives continues to be incredibly important, whether it's selling tickets, doing mid-outreach for fundraisers, or better yet, how about buying and selling some of our products? Overdependence on foundation fundraising weakens our imagination and poses one of the greatest threats to our movements. In reality, we should not expect much from something that was never created with our benefit or interests in mind. That is why there are activists and organizers out there every day trying to get folks to envision what this world could look like. Every day, as chunks of this huge mockery fall to the ground, another activist begins to ask hard questions about the nonprofit model. There is more heart than there is cash for this work. Fighting for freedom has always been, and remains, unpaid work, regardless of what any capitalist system might tell us. Once we connect with that spirit, we will soon realize that we have always been powerful, bestowed with an untouchable wealth, something to which no amount of tracking or monitoring of our organizations will ever give them access. The morning after things move more slowly now. We've lost a few people in the transition. Our lives are crazy. We have more outside requests than we can handle, and there is the pressure to succeed after such a drastic step. On the other hand, young women have stepped up, and their leadership is more prominent than ever in SIS. Although all of the attention is hard at times, it's empowering to know that people are open to finding alternative ways to build and work in this movement. We are not saying that all foundations are bad. In fact, there are program officers who have been like partners to us and who continue to support us however they can. But once the chase for foundation dollars begins to seriously affect your direction and your energy, something has to change. We are also not of the belief that 501s are bad. In our view, the problem is a lack of balance. The proliferation of 501s in the U.S. has meant a decline in grassroots movement organizations, and this has definitely blunted our edge and willingness to challenge the system. We need more grassroots movements that can partner and collaborate with nonprofit organizations to forward their visions. As a nonprofit organization that started as a grassroots organization, we constantly reflect on our work to ensure it remains aligned with our values. At SIS, we are willing to stumble as we experiment with different ways to create alternatives and model our vision. We want to make sure that we are whole and connected and doing the real work, the work that saves our lives and empowers our communities. With every sister that is a little more powerful and thinks differently because of their encounter with SIS, we are successful. We don't know what the most effective strategy is for revolution, but we do know that many different approaches are necessary. It isn't about toppling capitalism in one swift blow, but creating cracks in the system. We are a small crack inspired by larger ones like the MST in Brazil, the EZLN in Chiapas, Autonomista movements in Argentina, the Ogoni people in Nigeria, and many others all over the world. As we build these alternative and autonomous movements, we will crack the whole thing. We know capitalism will crack. Notes the co-authors are all Sista 2 Sista Collective members. If you want to support SIS, please contact us at info@sisteazista.org or visit our website at 1 Arsene Aguilar et al. Fairness in Philanthropy, Part 1, Foundation Giving to Minority-Led Nonprofits, uploads PDFs 12021-22910, Foundation1.pdf.